Hey everyone, welcome to my talk about how to build a great AMP framework integration. My name is Sebastian Benz and I work on the AMP developer relations team. Over the last year I've been working on integrating AMP into different frameworks. And what I learned is that there are a few best practices when it comes to integrating AMP into a framework. And this is what I want to talk about today. My talk is about frameworks, but these best practices, they are not really specific to frameworks. The same principles apply to integrating AMP into a CMS or when setting up a custom template-based build flow. But before we dive into the details, there's one thing you're probably wondering about. Why does AMP need to be integrated into a framework? Isn't AMP supposed to be a framework by itself? Well, yes and no. So AMP is a web components framework. It offers everything out of the box you need to build a fully interactive and performant page. However, when it comes to building a whole website, there are many more things that are important and that are not covered by AMP. So how to organize my templates, or how to manage my CSS, or how to build and deploy my website. And this is where general web frameworks come in. They can offer great solutions for these problems, and they are often a perfect addition to AMP. AMP takes care of making it easy to build and maintain a web page with a great user experience, and the framework takes care of everything else that is needed to successfully build and deploy a whole website. For the rest of my talk, I'm going to reference two different framework integrations, Next.js and Eleventy. Next.js is a very popular React site generator, and Eleventy is a very simple static site generator using a more traditional template-based approach. Both frameworks work really great and I'm a big fan. And of course, these are not the only frameworks which integrate AMP. Most notably, WordPress, for example, offers a really great AMP support. But I'm going to focus on these two because I know these best. But before we dive into the details, let's take a look at what a great AMP support can look like. Okay, here we have a simple Hello World page implemented in Next. And by default, it's using React on the server and on the client. To enable the AMP mode, we have to export a variable called config, which enables AMP. And the document more or less looks the same, but we see that this time we have a valid AMP document. And we can start using AMP components. So let's add an image. And I'm going to be using a picture of my dog, Mats. And I'm going to be adding a layout. Let's use the responsive layout. And I'm lazy. I'm just going to specify the aspect ratio. And here we go. We have a working AMP page showing an AMP image. And the interesting thing here is what I didn't do. I didn't have to set up the actual AMP document. I didn't have to import the runtime, AMP runtime, and so on. And I think this is a really nice development experience because we can focus on building the actual page instead of setting up the AMP boilerplate. And this is one example where a framework really can help improve the AMP development experience. Now let's use an actual AMP component. So I want to show an image carousel with more images of Mats. So again, I'm going to be using the responsive layout, same aspect ratio, and I'm going to add a few more images. Here we go. And we have a working image gallery with more pictures of Mats. And again, I didn't have to set anything up. I just wrote down the markup that I needed for my page. In this case, the AMP carousel. And Next.js in the background analyzes the source code of my page and recognizes every component that's being used and will automatically import it in the resulting page. And this is really a fantastic and seamless development experience. And it feels a little bit like web development from 20 years ago. We are just using HTML and CSS. And personally, I think this is this is really fantastic. Here's another example. So there's the AMP Lightbox Gallery component, which you can use to turn any carousel or image into a separate Lightbox image experience. And the only thing you have to do is you have to add the Lightbox attribute. And now when I'm clicking on the image, the image opens in the Lightbox mode, and it's a different, really nice way to scroll through all the images on the page. And usually you would have to import a different component, the AMP Lightbox Gallery component, but here I just have to add the attribute and it works. Again, really nice. Another thing where Next.js helps developers in being more productive in developing AMP pages is, for example, modularization. So Next.js uses React under the hood. And in this case, the AMP document is rendered server-side using React. And one of the really nice things about React is that it has a really nice way to separate your code into different components. And let's just add a header component that we could use on all of our pages. So I'm just gonna define this new component. Let's call it my head. Normally you probably would put this into a different file, but it's easier to keep it here in the same file. So at our header component, it receives a title, and it's gonna return a header element. And inside the header element, we're going to render the title. Nothing happens, of course, because we haven't added it to our page. So let's do that. And I can use it like any other custom element. And one thing, we have to provide a title. Let's use Matzi. And if we take a look, I need to scroll up, and here we have our header component on our page. And it looks a little bit ugly, so let's add a little bit of CSS. So this is how you define CSS in Next.js for your AMP components or AMP pages. And I'm gonna add a different background color. Let's make it teal and change the color to white and add a little bit of padding. Okay, here we go. It's a little bit less ugly. But the cool thing here is that the CSS is scoped to this specific component. And this means only if I import the component on the page, the CSS is going to be added to the inline custom styles in AMP. And this really helps because it makes it easier to stay within the AMP CSS limit. So that's all for my demo now. So I demonstrated two things. One, frameworks can help developers by setting up the environment, in this case, by setting up the whole AMP document. And the other thing is developers can benefit from the features that the frameworks provide out of the box. In this case, that you can use React to build AMP pages. Now, let's take a look into what it takes to build such a great AMP integration. I've created a simple checklist with the 4 most important things to do. So let's start with the first item on the list, adding required AMP markup. As you probably know, AMP requires specific markup for a document to be considered valid AMP. For example, the lightning bolt and the HTML tag, or the AMP boilerplate code. Also, the AMP runtime script needs to be imported, as well as any AMP component script that's being used. As a developer, ideally, you shouldn't have to bother with it. And you can help as a framework developer. The first thing you can do is to automatically add any missing required tags and attributes to the head. We've seen this in the Next.js demo before. As a developer, I didn't have to do anything to set up an AMP document. Here we see a code snippet showing all the markup that's required by AMP. And the good thing is, there's no variability in the markup, so it's easy to automatically add anything that's missing. The basic approach is take this list of required elements and check whether these are defined in the document, and if not, simply add them. The next step is a little bit more complicated, auto-importing all missing AMP components. For most AMP components, it's straightforward to implement by looking at the tag name. As in this case, if you see an AMP Twitter element being used on the page, you import the AMP Twitter component. However, for a few components, you have to analyze attribute names or values to be able to tell whether they are used. For example, you need to import the AMP-FX collection component if the AMP-FX attribute is set on an element. However, you can automate most of these things by simply using the AMP validation rules as an input, because these define these relations between attributes and components. But implementing this is definitely worth the effort, as it makes the overall editing experience so much better. And the last thing you can do to help developers is adding support for inline AMP script. This is a really small thing to do, but super helpful for developers. AMP script allows developers to add custom JavaScript to their AMP page. For security reasons, inline AMP script requires an additional script hash. And this is super annoying to maintain manually, because the script hash needs to be updated every time the script changes. And that's really annoying. But you can help a lot by adding this simple feature. But this is all. By following these 3 steps, you can make it a lot easier for developers to get started with building AMP pages in your framework. So let's move on to the next item on the list, CSS. As you all know, for performance reasons, AMP requires all CSS to be inline. And in addition, it limits the maximum amount of CSS that can be used on a page. This poses a few challenges when building a website with AMP, and frameworks can help a lot here. The first thing that they have to do is to automatically inline all CSS used by a page. And this is required by AMP, and there's no way around it. The other thing to do is to compress CSS by default to make it harder to hit the 75 kilobyte limit. Finally, probably the most important part is to provide an easy way to modularize your CSS. Because when it comes to staying within the CSS limit, modularizing CSS is the best way, because it allows you to only pull in CSS that's really needed on a page. Here is an example from the AMP 11. The plugin automatically merges all CSS on a page into a single inline style block. This means you can easily define components inside template partials which combine markup and CSS. In this example, we have a simple button component that requires some custom CSS. And if you integrate this button into a page, the required CSS will be automatically pulled in and added to the inline style block. And this is a really great approach because it helps you keep your CSS small. However, this is just one example for one way on how to do this. There are many other ways on how to achieve the same thing. Now, the next item on the list is validation. One of AMP's core features is the built-in validator. The validator checks if a given HTML document is valid. And it provides incredible important feedback to developers, so really make sure to integrate it, for example, as part of the build flow. One tip: if you need to include custom JavaScript during development, for example, to support live reloading in the browser, you can use the AMP dev mode attribute to tell the validator to ignore these custom bits of JavaScript. This helps a lot by removing unneeded noise from the validation results. The final item on our list is optimize. But before we talk about how to optimize AMP pages, we need to first talk about why this is important. End of May, the Google search team announced that they are going to measure how the page is experienced by user in addition to prior signals such as the page's usefulness. And this suite of measurements is called page experience. It uses the core web vitals which the Chrome team announced earlier in May and adds other pre-existing signals such as mobile friendliness, safe browsing, and HTTPS security on top of it. And core web vitals measure three things: whether a page loads fast, how long it takes to be interactive, and whether it avoids content jumps on load. The key part is, core web vitals are measured based on real-world user data. AMP pages offer good performance out of the box, in particular when they're served from an AMP cache. But it's also to optimize performance on the origin, because users will also access AMP pages there, for example when they land there via Twitter. And here's an example. The chart shows the largest contentful pane metric for the AMP homepage amp.dev. So the largest contentful pane metric measures the time until the largest visual element in the first viewport has been painted. We can see that it performs really well in the AMP cache, but there's room for improvement on the origin. The reason for this is that AMP has been optimized for being served from an AMP cache. And the good news is, it is possible to perform the same optimizations as an AMP cache does on your own origin. The thing is, these optimizations need to be performed server-side, which is why the AMP can't perform these for developers out of the box. And this way, we've been able to achieve the same performance on the origin as on the AMP cache for amp.dev. So when it comes to optimizing AMP pages, you should be doing all the things that you do for any web page. So minify HTML, CSS, optimize images, preload hero images, and really important, optimize server response time. However, there's one thing that's specific to AMP, and that is server-side rendering the AMP layouts. AMP makes it easy to build responsive websites by providing custom layouts, such as a responsive layout. By default, these are rendered client-side by the AMP runtime, but it's much faster to do this on the server, or even better, during the build. Beyond that, the AMP team is actively working on more things that will improve AMP's performance on the origin. So one thing I'm really excited about is being able to self-host the AMP runtime. Another great thing that's coming is that we're going to reduce the bundle sizes for the AMP runtime by using JavaScript module. If you want to learn more, check out go.amp.dev/optimize-amp. And that's it. We are done with our checklist. So automatically adding the required AMP markup, inlining and optimizing CSS, validating your AMP documents, and optimizing the documents. These are the four most important things you should focus on when integrating AMP into a framework. And these steps apply basically to any kind of AMP integration. Now you might be wondering, if they are always the same, can't we somehow make these easier? And yes, we can. And it's possible by using AMP Optimizer. AMP Optimizer is a tool developed by the AMP team that implements the same performance optimizations as AMP caches. And the latest 2.0 release added a few new features specifically targeted towards making it easier to integrate AMP into framework. And this is how the AMP Optimizer works. It's a Node.js library, and by the way, we're also working on a PHP version, and you give it an AMP document as input, and it will return an optimized version of this. The cool thing is, you can even pass in incomplete HTML documents. In this case, we only pass in a single AMP Twitter tag. And it will still turn this into a valid AMP document. And it looks like this. Okay, so this might be a little bit overwhelming, so let's take a closer look. So it creates a valid AMP document by including head and body. And you can see that it's an optimized AMP document via the transformed attribute on the HTML. It will also automatically import the AMP runtime and any AMP component that's being used on the page. In this case, the AMP Twitter component. Finally, it server-side renders the component's layout. And it does this by injecting the required spacer div and CSS for the responsive layout. So this means AMP Optimizer actually performs most of the steps we discussed in our checklist for you. And this also includes basic optimizations such as HTML and CSS compression. And we recently added even image optimization. And this is how the integrations in Next.js and Eleventy work. Both have AMP Optimizer built in. So AMP Optimizer takes care of adding the required markup and auto-importing AMP components. And this makes the framework integration a lot easier because frameworks only need to implement the parts specific to their framework. For example, how to configure the AMP mode, but they don't have to handle any of the AMP-specific parts. And the best thing about this, every new optimization that comes to AMP Optimizer will automatically be rolled out to your framework users as well. To summarize, AMP works great with many frameworks. And with AMP Optimizer, it has become a lot easier to integrate. So, check out the Go links if you're interested in the existing integrations or if you want to learn more about AMP Optimizer. Thanks a lot.